So I'm going to take you through rocker head to toe. So by the end of this video, you guys will understand that when you're buying your next board, what sort of rocker it has and what pros and what cons you're going to have by having that rocker on your new board. Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Luke Hart here, board shaper, board designer, board geek more importantly, and this is for the board geeks out there. Today I thought it'd be a really good idea to talk about rocker. As we've gone through some of the important parts of what makes a surfboard feel good, feel bad, work well with waves, work good for some surfers, bad for other surfers. We've gone over some fins, we've gone over, you know, everyone talks about shape continuously, but I want to break down another key area of a surfboard that's often overlooked, which is surfboard rocker. To put simply, surfboard rocker is one of the biggest parts of a surfboard that influences how much board is touching the water when you're moving down the line and when you're paddling, when you're in the water, basically. The idea, a lot of surfboard design, the idea is to take board out of the water when you don't need it touching the water and put board in the water when you do need it touching the water to get the best balance of control, maneuverability and speed maintenance. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I tend to nosedive this board because it hasn't got enough rocker. And that one kind of annoys me a little bit. I'm sure it's true to a point that a flatter board is going to want to go under the water if you take off steeply, but also a flatter board will paddle in earlier. You'll be able to stand at your feet at an earlier part of the wave, not then requiring such a steep angled takeoff. So rocker isn't just about nosediving. In fact, it's actually a really small part of it. One of the biggest parts of a rocker is the ability to control and maneuver the board in and out of the pocket. So I'm going to take you through rocker head to toe. So by the end of this video, you guys will understand that when you're buying your next board, what sort of rocker it has and what pros and what cons you're going to have by having that rocker on your new board. Okay, so first I'm just going to break down, you know, essentially what is rocker. Rocker is the curve of the surfboard. Well, basically, as a shaper's point of view, from the middle up to the nose, from the middle out to the tail. So you call this entry rocker as the water enters underneath the board because you're going that way, and exit rocker or tail rocker as the water exits out of the board. And that's essentially what rocker is. We tend to break it down into three parts: nose rocker, tail rocker, and bottom rocker. That is where the board bottoms out. And then within that, there is two types of rocker. We would call a continuous rocker, which has quite a defined point of a bottom rocker and not much flatness in the bottom. And then we have a staged rocker, which usually has a flatter section of the board through the middle, and then nose lift and tail lift. So you can kind of think of it as like the chassis of a car, the thing that connects the fins, the rails, the concave and the outline all together. That's the feeling of the rocker. So there's all different ways around utilizing the rocker in your design. But if I talk you through what those different parts of the rocker do, you might be able to define what sort of surfer you are, what you like the feel of, and therefore what rocker makes sense for your next board, because it doesn't make sense having loads of rocker on, for example, a glidey mid-length, but it might make sense for the same surfer who has a glidey mid-length. They might want a bit more rocker on their shortboard. So we're gonna take you through that. Let's start with flat rocker. No rocker at all. That means you're going to have a higher percentage of that board engaged in the water, and that's going to give you more speed, faster paddling for sure, and a general feeling of trim and down the line speed if you just stand on the board and do nothing. Where you'll find that normally is boards that you want to trim on, so things like longboards and mid-lengths and, you know, classic sort of pivoty kind of shapes, and then shorter little nuggy boards where it's so short your stance is barely covered by the outline and you want as much of that engaged in the water as possible to maintain speed. Because if you have a short little dumpy board with loads of rocker, it's going to become so loose and hardly have any drive. You're not going to be able to control it through the turns. So you have less rocker on those flatter boards. And the kind of conditions where flatter rockers work is flatter waves, essentially. Weaker waves, waves where you want to gain as much speed as possible. You might want to go for a shorter rail line and a flatter rocker, or a really long rail line and flatter rocker, in which case you're going to be doing less maneuvers, but you're going to find it easy to stand there, do nothing and trim along. Got one board is the flat rocker board that I'm showing, that hopefully the footage is going to pick up. And then you've got like the absolute sort of most amount of rocker you'll ever see on a board, like on a high performance shortboard. This is the Almerit CI Pro, which to my knowledge is the highest rocker board, performance board you can get. It's a proper banana. Now if you go somewhere in the middle, a flat rocker and a high rocker, you get something called like a staged rocker, which basically has sort of flatness in the middle. So you kind of take the middle of this board, the flat board, and then you lift the nose up slightly and you lift the tail. And what that does is that gives you the ability to gain the speed with front foot momentum. So when you're building your own speed, you've got that flatter platform in conjunction with the outline is going to get you bursting down the wave. And then when you get back onto your tail, that extra tail kit's going to give you that maneuverability and that poise, and the extra nose lift is going to mean that the nose isn't going to be in the way when you're utilizing that tail from rail to rail transitions. When you're doing that nicely and aggressively, if you have a flat nose along with that tail, you're going to get a bit of drag from the tail from the added curve, and the nose is going to kind of bury and dig through the turn. So with two-stage rocker, which is kind of in between a flat and a moderate rocker, it's kind of like that best of both worlds feeling. I quite like having a two-stage rocker on someone who's quite front-footed, or someone who likes gaining their own speed as much as possible. I think it's quite a happy medium between like stability, down the line speed, and a bit of forgiveness as well. And then when you come to this higher end, this is like continuous high rocker. You've obviously got as little borders touching the water as possible. So if you can't generate your own speed, you're going to be pretty lost on these things. You're only going to gain speed if you're in the perfect spot in the pocket of the wave.
Wait, I've got a question. Stage rocker, what boards would you find it on? All types of boards?
All types of boards, yeah. Stage rocker tends to be on standard short boards, especially your everyday kind of boards. Yeah, so you would find stage rockers hybrids. You know, like Doofer, classic example of a pretty staged rocker. A weird board would be the Rockstar, because the Rockstar's kind of got a continuous, but it's actually quite a flat continuous, if that makes sense. So you've got lots and lots of different variations within it. But yeah, you tend to see something with a more staged rocker on a pretty standard all-round shortboard. Then a good wave board, you probably see more continuous. And then the other way you see continuous is like smaller, nuggy high performers. Stuff like the HP Chili.
It's continuous, but it's a flat rocker.
Yeah, deep singles usually. So you got the rocker on the rail line, which is quite continuous for really fast, whippy inside turns, but then you flatten out the bottom of the board with quite a lot of concave, which gives you lift and does effectively mean that your rocker along the middle of the board is flatter than your rail. And that's for a high-performing surfer. Someone who's always on rail, they want to use that curve, but when they're down the line gaining speed, they get loads and loads of lift from that flatter section in the board. Staged rocker, having that flat here, you know what it's like when you're driving off your front foot. That's where you gain your speed. You very rarely sort of try and gain speed by pumping off your tail. You're normally...
That's more for turning, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, some back-footed surfers do kind of get going off their back foot, but you're going to have to put pressure on your front foot to really gain down the line speed if you're trying to generate your speed from being higher in the wave. And a staged rocker is really helpful for that. So really front-footed surfers would find that continuous rockers probably aren't offering them enough down the line trajectory. And another interesting point as well is that if you think about what rocker actually is, it's just fixed flex. Why you find really powerful surfers not liking lots and lots of rocker too much, even in the same waves as a lighter person would like lots of rocker, why you're fighting that generally is because they have the ability to gain more flex either side on the board through their turns with the compression and torque that they're putting on the board. Yeah. So a lighter surfer wants to set in more flex so they can get the board maneuvering. Whereas a heavy person, they can get a flat board and they're bending it just with their power. So they tend to need more. And that's kind of overlooked. Yeah, that's why you'll often find a heavy mix. Like if you went on tour, not everyone would have tons and tons of rocker because they're a good surfer. Because that's the other thing you can do with rocker is I can say, all right, this is 5.5 inches of nose rocker and this is 2.5 of tail rocker. Okay. Yeah, so that's from the bottom of the rocker to the top of the rocker. Now, how different can I make that curve? I could just make it completely straight, and I could make it loads of flip in the end. And that's why rockers are so different from different shapers, because if I have loads and loads of flip in the end, that means I've got more board engaged via that height. And it means I've got less way of getting that board out of the way through a turn. And if I've got hardly any curve and loads of straight, it's very hard then to drive off of my board because it's so high in the water. Because everyone knows this. If you've got the feeling of momentum on a wave, it's because your board is going downhill. And if you've got the feeling of gaining slower on your board, it's because your board is doing that. Now, if you stand on a short board in the slowest part of the wave, right at the bottom, it'll be doing that. You're anchoring the tail, you're anchoring the fins, all your weight's on the bottom, and then blah, 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 you fall off. Yeah, and if you go too heavy on that, it goes too much the other way and you anchor it on the nose. Another interesting thing about rocker that people don't generally expect is the balance of rocker. So you can have 5.5 inches in the nose and 2.5 inches in the tail, and the difference is 2.5, 3 inches. If I put a 1/2 inch extra in the tail and a 1/2 inch lower in the nose, the difference is still 3 inches. So how do we know when the board's flat where it's sitting, where the bottom of the rocker becomes? Essentially, a high performance board normally has the bottom of the rocker around about centered, slightly back, in some cases, rarer cases, slightly forward. But that's going to dictate where your flat spots are. If you think about nose rocker, watch this. So this has got 2.5 tail. So if I put all the pressure on the board so the tail's flat, see what happens to my nose?
Way higher.
Yeah, so if my tail was flatter, I couldn't push it down that much, my nose isn't going to come out of the water as much. So the turning radius is going to be far greater with less tail kick. So forget the outline, forget all of the other things. Yeah, so you need tail rocker to be able to get your turns nice and tight. But do you know what happens if you have too much curve in your tail? Have you ever surfed a longboard, like a nose riding longboard, and they have the crazy sort of tail kicks with the, like the skin of cherry picker and things like that? Well, they add drag. You're paddling and you can kind of feel there's so much curve at the back of the board. You don't have that smooth connection with the face of the wave. So all of that curve adds to your maneuverability but takes away from your forward trajectory, especially when paddling. So having flatter rockers doesn't necessarily mean less performance. It really depends how back-footed you are, what wave you're surfing, and what you're trying to do on that wave. Because sometimes a lovely flat rocker can create that, like the FM, pretty flat. Not super flat, actually. It looks flatter than it is, which is a crazy thing. But basically with the FM, the bottom of the rocker is brought forward and the tail rocker is actually high, but there's hardly any curve in it. So if you can imagine the tail down now.
It's a gradual sort of.
It's a very gradual curve in the tail, but it's so far up here, when you're stood, lots of planing area, so the nose isn't kind of getting in the way, so you've got quite a decent swing weight. So that's why the FM kind of turns really nicely. Whereas if it was just completely flat.
Would that make the board do that a little bit?
It would make you anchor down, but the further the bottom of the rocker is away, the flatter that whole bit is. So the weight is quite even, so it would happen less if the tail kick was more. With the same distance away, you would then put the weight on the tail, it would lift it up more and it would anchor more. Yeah, so the curve in the rocker is absolutely everything. And to try and explain away the perfect blend is nonsense, because I can find boards on tour with completely different rockers for equally as good high-level surfers. Right, I kind of blammed on a bit there. The other feeling is if you've got too much rocker, then the board is going to feel loose, maybe too loose. You might be sliding it out, and you're going to find it harder to generate speed, so it will feel slower. So if your board feels like you're like, oh, I don't get it, it's the same dimensions I always have, but it just feels slow, and then I'm sliding out on the bottom, too much rocker for you. Try something with a bit of a flatter rocker. And then if your rocker is too low, then that is going to make the board faster, and it's definitely going to make it more drivey because you're connecting with the downward trajectory of the line of the wave. But it's harder to turn and the turning radius is a lot longer. So if you're feeling like, oh, it feels brilliant down the line, really nice and drivey, but as soon as I go to turn it, it just feels a little bit stiff and I can't quite get back into the pocket, not enough rocker for you and the way you're surfing that board. So flat is kind of skatey and fast, and you know, you'll get less predictable boards. You know, that bit of slide that looks really cool on the end of turns, that's going to come from flatness. But if you want tight arcs and really sort of pinpoint surfing, that's going to come from more curve in the board. And if you want to choose the right rocker, I'll give you some rules of thumb. You know, small waves and weaker waves, beach break kind of thing, stuff we have in Cornwall quite a lot. Flatter rockers are going to give you a bit more speed and glide, for sure. So then you might want to have a flatter rocker, but then set the rest of your board up for something a little bit more manoeuvrable, so a looser kind of fin set up. I tend to push the front fin up a little bit for our waves. Usually you're going to get a little bit more bang for your buck in weaker waves with slightly flatter rockers, or staged rockers if you're you know, super sort of pro and you want the best of both worlds. And then steep or hollow waves, more rocker, because the wave's giving you tons and tons of speed. In fact, when you're surfing steeper waves, you're actually trying to find the line of control, not the line of speed. So when you're in a wave where you're trying to maximize as much speed as possible, flatter rockers, they're gonna find all the speed in that wave. But if you're on flatter rockers in really, really good waves, well, you're not trying to look for speed, you're looking for a controlled line so you can stay in the pocket of the wave. So more curve is what you want, and it's not because of nosediving, it's because of what I've explained in the rest of this video. Heavier waves and larger waves with lots and lots of power, you flatten off the rocker, because you want to try and build in some drag to that board and some control on the face. If you have loads and loads of rocker, you're not going to be able to stay in that powerful line. And obviously a really, really heavy wave, usually kind of big, you've got quite a lot of surface area to go through. The wave's curving like this, hollow, mad crazy, but you're going down this line. You're surfing like a convex wave, so you really, really want slightly less rocky. You don't want that board to be unpredictably twitchy because you're moving so fast. You want it to be kind of freight trainy, holding a line. So any sort of wave where you're holding a line, a little bit less rocker, especially in the tail, is a really key element. And I often see like that mistake made where people think loads and loads of rocker for those like heavier, kind of bigger waves.
I would have thought that.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
well, it's like if you're not doing turns, why do you need rocker kind of thing? You know? Yeah. Like you want drag almost.
Then I thought a minute ago you said tail rock
Adds drag. Yeah, but it takes away surface area to the wave, so you've got less control. This is where it's complicated and amazing fun. Yeah, I know. It is. It's complicated, but it's obvious as well. Well, if you get drag from curve and you've got less fin in the board, you're going to have less drive forward. So basically a big heavy wave where it's just say, I'm going to take off and then I'm going to set my line and I'm going to try and make it out the barrel. That will be easier to do on slightly flatter rockers. Not flat, but just flat. You're not going to find that line quick enough, and the line's not going to react enough without you having to do something. And what happens when you're in a heavy wave and you try and go up the face? Bang! You know, you're up and gone. Yeah. You know, quads and flatter rockers and heavier waves are like, that's what people have found in the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And then, yeah, I've touched on this earlier in the video, but sort of lighter surfers, and when I say light, weight, obviously, but also the way in which you set your weight. Some people can be quite heavy-footed. They tend to be back-footed. I would say those guys are slightly less rocker, but someone who's an advanced surfer who's lighter in weight and then lighter footed and a bit more front footed, gaining your speed, more rocker. Board's just going to be easier to turn. It's going to feel super fruity, and you then have the ability to a little bit like Raynon, the guy we've just started making boards for. This is actually his Merrick. He's 72 kg and he rides 29.7 litres of foam because he loves the stability and the forgiveness of all that foam. And he's a top level surfer, currently in the semi-finals of the French Nationals. He's fourth on the QS. This guy is super high level and he rides a lot of foam for a pro surfer. But then, what's his favourite Al Merrick board? The most rocker board you can get. So imagine if I gave him 29.5 litres and flattened out this rocker. Suddenly it becomes dead, hard to turn, not as fast around the corner, and it would start feeling big. Exactly. You know, to summarise what we're doing with rocker, because I know that I've banged on quite a lot. When you're choosing what rocker to have, firstly, think of the style of board you're having, then why you want that style and what you want to produce in terms of your surfing on that board. And then you want to suit it to the wave, your skill level, and then what you're happy to give up for the feeling that you'll get. For example, if you want it to be really, really tight in the pocket and kind of high performing sharp turns, then if you're not prepared to give up a load of extra paddle and down the line trajectory, you might want a slightly higher rocker with a two-staged rocker with a little bit of flat in the middle. If you're absolutely happy, you just want the most responsive board possible, then go for those continuous curves, and the higher you go, the looser it's going to be, but the slower it's going to be. And if you want something that's always got speed built into a maximum, flatter rockers, slightly shorter rail lines will help add that control. And then the fun part is trying to find all the different rockers of all the different shapers, because we've all got our own way of adding that magic where people are really surprised, oh my word, it's so fast, but it's also really loose. And you know, oh, you've got loads of pivot on the bottom, but loads of drive. And you're gonna get those words from surfers, and that will come from the blend on the curve of how you've done that rocker. And I'll be here all day if I'm telling you all the different versions of rockers that you can have. If you want to find your perfect rocker, then try something really flat, try something really rockered, and eventually you're going to start building your own process into what you really like. Because Joan, as a surfer, you tend to like slightly less rocker.
Yes.
Yeah, but you also quite like slightly more foam. So then you have to do stuff to the board
To make it a bit looser.
yeah. Or you deal with the fact that the board's slightly more lateral, and that builds into your style. And I think over the last couple of months, that's what you've done. And you're starting to, I think, shine the way you surf is starting to come through more as you develop. So it's not necessarily you're getting better at surfing, but you're just getting more in tune with who you are as a surfer. Whereas Raynon's the complete opposite. He's just an absolute hellcat, like just up and like, I'm going to batter that, and then I'm going to batter that, and then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to pump like crazy, I'm going to do an air, you know. And it's like, makes complete sense that he has quite a lot of rocker to deal with all of those quick changes. So who are you? Who are you? Are you a guy on loads and loads of rocker complaining about lack of drive and speed, or are you one of those surfers who are on a flatter board who wants to get a little bit, you know, tighter turn? It's an absolute can of worms, but it is, I would say, fins are the biggest part of a surfboard's feel and workability. And then the next thing in line has to be rocker and the flex of a board. Has to be. Those two things are just like integral to the feel of the board. You can tweak an outline here and there, but essentially rocker, that's that set flex that we're going is gonna really, you're gonna find a pattern in your surfing and what you love based on the rocker and the fins as well. Yeah, hope that's helped. I know I've gone on a little bit there. Tune in next time. We're going to do another Board Geek Out video soon. If you've got any questions, drop them in the comments and I'll do my best to answer for a couple of days. And we'll see you on the next video. Like, comment, subscribe. Cheers for your support. Thank you. Bye-bye.